The night belongs to us. We will bathe in their blood and relish their screams.
Hi everybody, I'm Mark White. I'm the former project lead and managing director for Southampton Vampire by night. So in this video I want to talk about the international part of the game. So one of the things that has confused and raised a lot of questions is when I turned around and said this was going to be an international LARP. Now that's a difficult thing to kind of explain at the time, but I'm going to spend the time in this video to explain exactly what I meant by that and the reasons behind it. So first of all, let me just discuss why we wish to make the game international, and the reason for that is financial. So one of the main reasons why a lot of LARP systems basically close doors and come to an end and see a dwindling player base beforehand is because they've exhausted the resources in their area. Now, if you are able to do a LARP fest, a massive LARP, like over here in the UK, we have ones like Empire, CP, I think, I'm not sure is the other one's called Lorien Trust or something like that, but there is the Gathering, I think it's called. But these are big LARPs which hold thousands of people. Now these draw people from all over the country and from around the world who come to play in that game. So people will travel 6, 7, 8 hours, just to come and play. These are normally run over a weekend and they normally take place between 4 to 5 times a year. Now that's a big LARP. Now this was never being designed for that. Then you have a LARP which caters between 50 to, let's say, 200 people, or 30 to 200, let's say. Now these are your this is the demographic we were going for. These normally take place, let's say, once a month or once every other month or something like that. They're not a regular game, but they are more regular than the large ones. And these will allow people will travel to these, but it's one of those that to get a committed player to that type of game that has to travel 8 hours to it to play every other month, I don't know. I know I wouldn't be committed to a game like that. I'd go along for the experience, but would I continue to go if the game started to decline? If the game was less interesting than that first one? Probably not. So then you have your parlour LARPs, the ones that are your local LARP that cater between, let's say, 5 to 50 players, that happen in the back room of a pub or a community hall or something like that, and they're normally between once a week to once a month, something like that, but they are normally a more regular game. So each of these styles has a benefit where the larger your LARP system is, the more likely it is you will draw people from a larger area to come and play. The smaller your LARP is, the less likely that is, and so you're having to only, your player base is basically your local city and maybe a city around you or two. And that's basically it. So what will happen is that over time you will have players that will join your game and then they will move on, either because they don't like it anymore or that they've got other commitments, etc., etc. So that's your normal kind of player. Then you have a player that will come along to your game, they won't like it, and they will tell their social group that they didn't like it and the reasons why. And now that group of people will be less likely to attend your game. You do have the opposite. Someone will come and enjoy your game and they will tell their friends, and then you will get some of those people come and play your game. But in either scenario, okay, you are using up those potential players in one way or another. And so as the game progresses and goes on for year after year, for example, um, your the chance of you drawing in newer players becomes less and less and less. Now you may say, yeah, but people move into the city and social groups change, and that you've got universities, for example, etc., etc. But the difference um, is that eventually, like in Southampton, that anybody that really had the potential of playing Vampire Larp has kind of already played in it, because the game ran for 20 odd years, um, and so eventually the player base just dwindled away. Um, so the the more so basically the issue that we had is that we'd seen a LARP actually be held ransom by the players because the game needed a certain amount of players to be financially viable, and then the players were aware of that, and so threatened to leave the game unless things happened the way they wanted it, because if they left they would take their social groups with them, which wouldn't be one player leaving, it would be 3 to 5 players leaving your game, and that has a big impact. So basically that's what happens towards the end of the life of the game, is that players start to do things like that. Now, so because of witnessing that and seeing a game in decline and seeing the local area and speaking to people that had formerly played Vampire and asking if they'd be interested in coming back, and pretty much been telling flat no, and those were people that used to enjoy the game, they're just, nah, I'm not interested in coming back, I've done what I needed to do, etc., etc. So that's because things, yeah, there's a lots of things that could have changed, but basically what we took out of that was that, as I say, you have a resource of players in your local area and maybe the surrounding cities, but eventually that resource will start to dry up. Also, if you're not doing any form of advertisement, then your resource will definitely dry up. So that was key for us as well, was advertisement for the game. But anyway, the international side of it came about because I kind of realised that people, when they play in games and stuff like that, do all sorts of things for LARP. People will play on Discord and do pay by mail, and people will do, like go onto a Discord server or play on Zoom, or even in some cases now, as I've seen, is play Vampire in VR. So the physical need to attend a game isn't a necessary thing anymore to play within a LARP, as long as the LARP organiser has catered in a way for individuals to play in that method. Now, I haven't seen a LARP which merged the two, and I thought there was a definite way of doing so. So when I sat down with my financial advisor and we went through the kind of projection of the project and how financially viable it was, what we were expecting growth to be, etc., etc. One of the things came very clear is that to try to run a game like we were, which was to be affordable, and still have that level of taking it from the back room of a pub and putting it into, let's say, an art gallery or an old castle or a nightclub or something like that. Those venues cost money, and we were budgeting for around about £500 per venue, between £300 to £500 a venue for a night. So because of that, we needed to charge our players a certain amount, and when we looked at the ticket price per game, it would have definitely been a game which wouldn't have worked for a bi-monthly kind of thing. It just wouldn't have been financially viable for people, because although we were going down a subscription route, which is another thing, which I'll talk about all the financing in the finance video, but basically the subscription route was a way to kind of steady out our payments, but even still, without any other form of payment coming in, the game just wasn't financially viable. We were way too reliant on keeping a player base, which was at the time pretty high. So I think we were looking at between I think it was 30 to 50 players we would have needed on the books continuously to either break even or slightly go into the red. And then after that, we would have started to make profit, which would have given us kind of like a buffer for those dry patches. But it just didn't work. It was like this wouldn't work out. And in the nicest possible way, I'm not going to go into details of it, but I have seen this with another LARP where basically the venue costs just made the project unviable. They managed to launch, but then there was issues with the venue costs. Because they were looking for a certain type of venue that could cater for a certain type of player base, and those venues just cost a lot of money. And unless you turn around to your players and say, we want this amount, and all of a sudden you're starting to price yourself into a bit where people are expecting a lot more from your game. So basically venue costs are the things that cause the biggest issue. If we had a really nice, venues that were free, God, most of the cost would have gone from the game. It would have been just like, whatever, we can spend some money on some fancy props and costumes and we're good. But venue costs suck. So that's why those backroom and the pubs and stuff like that games take place, because they're very cheap to run. But anyway, so financially, I went, right, we need something that's going to be a big part of the game, which will then give us another source of income, which is something that will never run dry. So the second you say you're international and you can make an international element of your game, all of a sudden your player base goes from a city, maybe the surrounding cities, to the world. And then all of a sudden, financially your game is very viable, because it doesn't matter. You can afford to reduce the ticket prices for your live players by introducing international elements into their game. So how are we going to do that? That's the beginning of it. That's the reason why we wanted to go international. Financially, that was it. It was important to make the game financially stable. That it was important. So how are we going to do it? So international play was going to work by doing the following. So we looked at the city in this regard, that your live players are street level. They are, for example, a fight breaks out in the street and two kindred are fighting in the middle of the road. None of them breaking a masquerade, but they're fighting in the middle of the road. Now, that fight takes place and you've got the local people coming out of their houses that are engaged one way or the other. And the influence those vampires have over those individuals, pushes the narrative one way or the other. Meaning, who's calling the police or who's throwing bricks and all of this kind of stuff. That's your local level. Now, all of a sudden, the police then turn up into the area. Now, who controls those police is now we're looking at international. We're looking at the big bad vampires. And I'll talk about what those vampires are, but basically you zoom out from street level and you go into to kind of like city or town or area or postcode area, and all of a sudden that is being looked at by someone who's international, and they're controlling that because they're controlling the buildings within. It's okay. You turn around to the neighbours that are on your side and you go, yeah, get him, and they throw bricks and all the rest of it. But would they throw bricks if a phone call came through to turn around and said, we need the money for your mortgage on your house, we want it now, or that your kids are going to be kicked out of the local school, or this kind of stuff where pressure can be put on them from that kind of overseer kind of level. So that's what we were looking at for international players in the local game, in the live game. They can have influence, but their influence is nowhere near be as much as these international mega player stroke vampires. So well, hopefully you've got an idea of it now. Street level, then bird's eye view, if you see what I mean. That was the difference between a live player and a international. Now, what we were then doing is we were dividing the city into their postcode areas. This is where we got 7,000 locations. These locations were made up within these postcode areas, each of which could be controlled. So what would happen is that international player would get a set amount of, we're going to call it XP, per month. And what they could do is they could spend that to just buy locations. And when they bought those locations, they would have attached to them influence. So, for example, street, hospital, bureaucracy, travel, all of those standard influences were attached to buildings. If it had 2 influence or 3 influence or 5 influence, that's how much XP it would cost that player to buy it. Now, if they ever lost that location, that XP would go back into their pool and they could redistribute it and spend it. So they would never lose their XP, they just may lose the influence that XP was being spent on. So the idea, and you'll probably think to yourself, well, what's the point of all of this? So the reason why they're taking control of influence or areas and stuff like that is because we had these charts that allowed them to do like super downtime actions, some of which were one-off spends where the first people to get there would get a use of it, and then when they've used it, like, you know, it's stamped, you can't use it again. But basically these mega plays would do things in the game. They would either, like, let's say there was a big load of masquerade breaches. Well, if you had loads of media, you could use one of your like spendable things to basically eradicate all masquerade breaches within a postcode area. So if there was a load happening there, you as an international player could be approached by the live players to say, oh my god, all of this just went down, we just had a big fight with the Sabat and there was fucking cameras there and we got caught, there's masquerade breaches all over the show. And then the international player can go, okay, for this cost of whatever they want to charge the players, I could eradicate all those for you. And they would spend off their big burn thing, their media influence kind of spendable, big, we call them, what do they call them, power play we called them. They use their power play, all the masquerade breaches go, and they decide the narrative of how that happens. So for example, it could be that they've attracted the attention of the public to something else, big parade or a big something scandal or something else, which means that the media focus goes there and it's less publicised in the local papers, people aren't really talking about it, and it's only a few and those people kind of get quieted over time. That's how the masquerade breaches get covered up. So that would be an example of a power play that the international player has got because they've hit a certain threshold of like total amount of media influence. Now, an international player, in my view, is a elder vampire that has been called away, and they are basically, they have a persona, a false identity. Now, this is how it was going to work, where we wanted to have international players being a bit of PvP going on. And how that works is, we called it noise. Every time you take a location, you get a point of noise. Every influence you spend on, like every XP you spend to basically buy the influence in a certain area, generates the exact same amount of noise to your character. Now, there were ways of leaving traps and, like with noise bombs, for example, where an international player could use a power play to basically leave a body or something incriminating within that location, and if that location was to then flip to somebody else, it would basically, they would blow the whistle, the police would turn up, or whoever it was, the media, and that thing would be found, which would draw attention to that location, thus producing more noise. So that's when we put noise multipliers on places. So we could also make it where players could defend a location, when if they defended a location using a downtime action, if that location was to then be attacked stroke flipped by somebody else, it would produce double the amount of noise, etc, etc. Now, the idea of the noise thing was that it was kind of like drawing attention to your elder vampire persona stroke, whatever you want to call it. It was their alternate identity. It was drawing attention to it. So eventually, if too much noise was generated, then that character would have to lose everything. They would have to burn it, basically. Like, if you had your IDs and the rest of it, think of it like, shit, you know, I've been made. They know my identity. I've got to burn all these fake ones because they're all useless now, etc., and start afresh. And you get a new identity and a new thing. That was kind of it. So the idea was that at that point they would have to burn their influence and start anew. And that's how an international player could die, basically. Now, what would also happen with these international player is, when it came to the PvP, the idea or the incentive was that if they took some key locations, so this is the stuff that kind of focused the international players down onto key buildings and stuff like this. If they took 3 key locations within a postcode area, they would flip that area control to their faction. So they could either play as independent, they could play as Sabat, or they could play as Camarilla. Now, if they flipped it to their faction, and members of their faction live players were to use downtime actions to feed in that area, they wouldn't have to spend a downtime action anymore to feed. It becomes free. If it was independent, they would have to spend 1 downtime action to feed, and if it was the opposite faction, they would have to spend 2 downtime actions to feed in that area. So that made an incentive for the live players to engage with the international, to say, look, could you please take this area for feeding, because our current feeding area is getting absolutely, you know, there's not enough blood in the area for us anymore, or that because of health influences being affected there, it's dropped down the levels, which means there's not as much blood before we start to generate loads of masquerade breaches. So there's that level of interaction between live and international. Then, so your international players now are not only trying to wrestle control of domain areas for their faction, they're also using these big power plays they're getting from gaining loads of influence, and during all of this they're trying to defend what they hold and also trying to generate not as much noise. Now, that's okay when you've got bit of PvP between players, but we wanted to have another element involved. We wanted to have something to stir the pot. What that was, we called it the city. Now, the city itself, we had it its own living organism, and the idea behind that was that the city would target and attack whoever generated the most noise. So the top 2 noise generators would be attacked by the city, meaning that it would target that player's influence and wrestle control of that influence away from them. And there was ways to manipulate the city, but the city was there as kind of like an NPC that would do these things. It would also continuously try, and that's why it was attacking the 2 highest noise. It was always trying to control at least 51% of the city. So it was just desperate to remain in control. If it ever lost control, then there would be ramifications where the city itself would start to play power plays to try to gain control back. And this was a way to basically mean that there was 3 kind of factions within the game, not just 2. So let's say the Sabat were to start massively gaining control, and the Camarilla had, you know, very few international players or something like that, and was getting pushed right back, and not many areas were in their control, etc. The city would start to target the Sabat to wrestle the control back from the Sabat until there was independent areas again, if you see what I mean. So it was always trying to control at least 50%, 51%, meaning if you looked at the map and the areas that we had in sections into postcode areas, it would mean that at least half of that should stay as independent at any one time. If it ever wasn't that case, then it would then start to fight back, if you see what I mean. And so that meant that it was strategic for international players to take and control areas, not permanently, but for periods of time, which married up with what was going on with the live players. And now you're probably thinking, well, how would we have communicated between live and international? How we have got that engagement? The first way was the forum. So I spoke about it briefly in other videos of how it went wrong, but the forum was critical because we wanted the forum to be the place where international and live players would talk to each other and have reasons to engage with each other and benefits for doing so. We also wanted to have it where international players could, via some costings, etc., not financial as in money for us, but like in-game costings, etc., via negotiations with live players, could basically have control of security during a game. So every game would have a means of one way or another, be it cameras or individuals walking around with cameras on them, that would allow via Zoom international players to join a Zoom call and basically see and be able to communicate through a camera. So what would happen is that the security would have a earpiece which would then pick up on the live Zoom, and then they would have a camera which would then show back to the Zoom call. So that way the international players could direct the security around the room during the live game and pick up on information and what's being said, or do stuff. And that was allowing our international players to basically interact at a live game. Now, what would have probably ended up happening is that certain clans would have gained control of these things more often than others, but we would have always had ways for international players to be involved, but their level of involvement without sharing that resource with other players would have been dependent on what they did, etc. So there was that aspect of it. We were also going to set up cameras at our games that would just be live camera feeds to a Zoom, which would allow international players to kind of gather in the same kind of Zoom call in a way and interact with each other whilst watching a game and listening to what's being said, etc. So there was that level of engagement. We also wanted to make it as well that an international player would create an elder kind of character, and if they ever did attend a live game, they could bring their character to the live game with those stats, etc. There would be a couple of caveats of things they can and cannot do, which would have all been done in character. For example, there'd be massive ramifications if your elder turns up and does X, Y, and Z, because it would then force other elder vampires to get involved, if you see what I mean. So the idea behind it was that international players, if they ever were in the country or were coming down this way, whatever, could play the game and have a character to play that was already invested in part of the world. So yeah, the international players would be doing huge things in the game. That was the idea behind it. That Excel document that I've kind of briefly talked about in another video is how it would all have worked. So what would happen is that, or how the influence would have worked, etc., was that all the international players would have had access to an Excel document, which is kind of nested to them. Then they would input their information of what they wanted to do on their document, which would then, because of a sheet or something, would have meant that could then the refs could have then kind of signed off on that. That would have then updated or gone into an update of a main spreadsheet, and then the results, when they were finalised, would kick out and go across all the others. The idea behind all of this was that basically every location in the game had an asset code and was built off of real, well, it was made from a real location in the actual city itself, and each of them had an influence attached to it and notes and stuff like that. And international players could basically just assign their XP to these areas, not knowing who controlled them. It could be nobody. It could be it was either the city or another player. Either way. And basically what they would do is they would just assign the XP to those areas to equal the amount of influence in them, and then their result would come back to them and it would say how much noise has been generated and how many of these things are now theirs. Now, they would always win, if that would make sense. They would always gain control of an area if they put the required amount of XP cost onto it. The only difference for those was the 3 key locations. Those in each of the areas, those had a different kind of setup to it. But basically, you assign your XP, the location flips to yours, and then you gain noise. And what you're hoping for is the same amount of noise that is XP of that location. But if there's been traps and whatever put on it, all of a sudden that location that had 3 XP that should have cost you 3 noise, just cost you 9. And you're trying to do this whilst you're trying to gain control of influence whilst making as least noise as possible, because you know if you're the top player for noise, or top 2 players for noise, the city will then come along and slap you and basically take its downtime, its turn to wrestle control back from you, which is really bad. So you were expecting this turn to gain, or this month's downtime to gain, a certain amount of influence in a certain amount of area, and because you've generated a shitload of noise, because of you got caught out, all of a sudden you don't generate as much influence as you thought you did, and it causes issues, etc., etc. That was the idea behind it. Now, power plays were there to basically, when you hit thresholds, these power plays you could then use, because you, as an international player, you would basically have access to, I think it was 3 or 5 downtime actions. Now, applying all of your influences and downtime actions, that's just the Excel spreadsheet stuff. What you could do is you could use downtime actions to heal noise, or you could use a downtime action to place booby trap stroke defences on some of your locations. You could use it to do power plays, and that's it basically. That's what they would have been able to do. But their power plays could be, it could be flip all assets in a location flip a location to your faction. So you basically gain control of the 3 key locations, would have all come under your control, and it would have flipped to you. You just would have generated a shitload of noise doing it, but that's what would have happened. That could be the power play. There was ones that lower the health in an area. There was an occult one, which basically meant that you were given like you were given a selection of things in magnitudes, and you could just put together your own kind of ritual spoke outcome, and it would last for a set period of time. The longer it was lasting and the more powerful it was, etc., was how much occult was required influence-wise to pull off the ritual. So there's loads of things like that. There was loads of we spent ages going through thinking what would be cool, what would be fun for these international players, how could we get the engagement between international and live. And I think that if it had all come along, it would have panned out. It would have been awesome. There would have been loads of engagement from people around the world that were able to play and get involved and learn about the meta plot that was going on and do all kinds of bits and bobs, and basically get to play as a big spooky elder vampire that was controlling aspects of the city and all of this kind of jazz. It would have been a lot of fun, and it would have meant for the live players the game felt real, like there was other vampires around the world that had their own goals and agendas and things that they were trying to do, and they could have made coteries with these individuals, and you would have had live players with coterie members that were from America or from Spain or from Germany or wherever, all working together to do this cool thing within our game, within a city, or you know, and I think that would have been absolutely awesome, because you've basically, what we've done is, or what we were planning to do, was to merge that kind of play by mail, you know, Zoom call, stroke VR, whatever you want to call it, merge that into a live game. And that's why, when I talked about in a previous video, when the Excel document, the individual who was working on that, let us down, had massive ramifications to the game, because it meant that financially it really wasn't viable as it was before, and it wasn't anywhere near as awesome as it was going to be. And all of the amount of time we spent working on the international stuff, wow, you know what I mean? Little things like every asset, so 7,000 of them, every single one of them had its real world name. And what we had to do was go through and change that to a name in the game. So when a player was to look at that postcode and look at that thing, although if they looked on Google Maps it would appear as its original name, any reference to it in our game would have come under as the pseudonym, the name we gave it. And the reason for that is because we didn't want to fucking besmirch or slag off or in any way make a company, a real world company, have any effect on it due to our game, if you see what I mean. We didn't want, you know, like, oh, I don't know, let's say something happened in the game which was really taboo, something that was really, you know, got a lot of people would, you know, I don't know, there was a people trafficking was taking place within a pub, and we used that pub's real name. It would mean that whenever players were out in the real world talking about that location, they would use that pub's real name, wouldn't they? Which means if anybody was overhearing that conversation, there was a chance that they would think that maybe that's the truth that was taking place, that that pub did have some people trafficking going on or something. You get what I mean? So by changing it to a completely fake name, we avoided that altogether. But that meant that we had to go through and change the name of 7,000 locations. It's harder than you think. When you've got to do, you know, like there's over 300 pubs or something in Southampton. I think there's even more than that. After a while, you know, you go through all the animals, you go through all the types of boats and king and queen, and because you can't just call something the Anchor, because there's a pub in town called the Anchor, for example. You've got to come up with something completely new. But anyway, yeah, so, yeah. But, yeah, the international stuff was something that I was quite proud of. It was it was going to be a really cool system that nobody had seen, and it was going to make, as I say, make the Larp international, which means financially, international players would not have paid anywhere near as much as live players, because they wouldn't have had to, there'd be no venue cost for them, etc. So for those, I think the international player cost was something like £30 or £60 a year subscription or something like that. I think it was 30, and it just meant that the idea is we were after quantity of those international players, and because the actual downtime system itself, because it was automated, had very minimal input in from the ref team. As far as we were concerned, there would have been maybe 2 refs dedicated to international, which would have gone through the Excel spreadsheet after a player had submitted it, just checking to make sure that what they had submitted is they're allowed to. And that there was no cheating going on and stuff like that. That would have basically been it. And then that would have been it. There were no downtime responses. There were no typing anything up or anything like that. You know, and those refs would have got to have played the big bad city, would have been their thing. So the international refs would have basically played the city, dealt with the downtimes, and basically just been a big part of that part of the game. Which meant that those refs could have been international, because they don't have to attend the game, which then makes it so if the game was international stuff was to get bigger and bigger and bigger, we've got an unlimited pool of potential refs to run it. So there's that. Yeah, it would have been cool. Like, I can honestly see it being cool. There would have been some really, because like at the game itself, we were going to have every every month, whatever it was, every month, 2 months when the games were taking place, we were going to make a social media kind of fake news report. So we're going to have the camera set up and green screen, and we're going to make it like a newsroom style stuff. And we were going to the actual activities that took place during that month would have all been like news reports that the players could then watch before they attended a game, and international players could also watch. And I think that would have been awesome for an international player to kind of, the noise that went off that generated loads of noise for them is in the news. Body found in old sweet shop. Led to believe taken via such a company. Strange purchase. Was it a cover up? Did this used to be? Were there other bodies stored here? Does that company hold any other bodies? Kind of thing, or is it a murder ring or a gang? Or you get what I mean? Like the news report would have been really fun for us to do, and the idea behind that would have been that the international refs would have submitted stuff that they think would be newsworthy, with kind of brief scripts behind it, and then the live game refs would do the same, and then we would have basically taken all that information together, worked it out into a script, made some funny little like sports stuff and weather reports and stuff like that, and just had some fun with it. And then it would just been a big fun little video that the team would have got together to make, every couple of months, instead of having to sit there and type up a fake newspaper or sit down and type through a kind of big downtime response that goes out to all the players. We'd have just done a live little news report. Yeah, it would have been cool. So yeah, that's international. That was how the game was going to work. I was going to make this video with like going through on my PC screen, showing you all the different kind of power plays and a map of the city and all of the assets and all of that. But I thought, generally that's not going to actually be that exciting for everybody. Eventually I believe when this series of videos is done, I might just make the project folders live or something so everybody can go digging through. But I think, like I say, I think the international stuff was a really good idea and important. So if you are making your own LARP and your own project and stuff like that, hopefully from this you can steal, borrow, use some of the ideas that I've discussed here to make yours international. And I feel that if you make your LARPs international and you do it in a way maybe not as in depth as I was doing mine, because it would involve a lot of upfront work, but if you can in any way add an international element to your game, it will definitely help you financially, and it will definitely help the long-term life of your game. Because what you're basically doing is you're giving your players opportunity to engage with other players they never would have engaged with. So your player base can get much bigger. And because of that international kind of element, it can really make your game world feel more alive. Now, for Vampire, it works perfectly. But for fantasy and stuff like that, there's nothing to say that there's another town over somewhere else that's going for its own hardships or something. And there's trade that could be set up between the two locations. So your international players in a fantasy game could be all about trade. And so instead of a resource just being given to a player, it can come from an actual real trader stroke player that's international, that can set their own prices and can do certain things to manipulate resource gathering, or I don't know. There's lots of options, but I feel like if you can give an international player enough that they can invest into the game and are enticed to have engagement with your players, it's going to benefit your game like loads. And financially, it's going to massively help your game, because, for example, for ours, I think it worked out that for every 4 international players made 1 live player. So if we were to have gained, I've got to do quick maths, but I'll make it easy for myself. 40 international players equates to 10 live players. That's pretty good going, That's a good amount of income, So, yeah. So there you go. Hopefully that kind of explained the international element. For all those that were looking at the project over the time, I apologise that I was unable to kind of communicate all of that across. It was a large part of the project that predominantly was worked on. Majority of the first year of the project is where the international stuff was focused on. I think it was the second year towards the end is when that relationship completely broke down with the individual that was doing the Excel document, which meant that the game had to radically change going into year 3. Yeah. So yeah, that's basically it. I mean, yeah, it had a lot of work dedicated to it. There's a lot of stress around it as well. But in hindsight, would I have changed it? Yeah. I'd have made it so I could have made it without relying on anybody else or paid somebody to do it, and I would have got the system in place before spending all the time working on it. So I'd have got that Excel document working and usable before spending all the time working on asset names and generating 7,000 locations and coming up with power plays and all of that crap. I'd have done that after we had a working Excel document. So yeah, so hopefully once again you found the video useful. Hopefully there's been some really cool learnings in here for people. More importantly, please share this within your communities. You know, make the video, post it on you know, Vampire pages or Larp pages or anything like that. The more you can signal boost these videos, the better. Because basically for me it means that my audience grows, more people see it, the channel has some growth in it. I know this channel isn't going to be a fucking 25k, 100k, a million subscribers, but it would be nice to have some more people join this community, so that way when my videos do go live they are seen by more people. That's my thing. You know, like I said in my last couple, that you know, I'll keep on making these when people still are watching them. As long as I can still see people are watching and the growth of the videos is going up, I'll keep on doing these. You know, because it's beneficial to everybody. If you're enjoying it, you're enjoying it. So there's my little thing at the end there. Excuse me. I say, hope you've all enjoyed it, and I love you all. Goodbye. See ya.